The invitation that changed everything. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Sandra Bullock's lakeside home in Vancouver, bouncing off the surface of her untouched cup of herbal tea. She stood silently in the living room, arms folded, gazing out at the water like someone searching for a sign. Her life had reached a strange quiet, not unhappy, not empty, but something between chapters, as if waiting for a page to turn on its own. It wasn't loneliness she felt, not exactly, but a yearning that had lived unnamed inside her for decades. Fame had its own echo, and success could be a loud companion, but when the lights faded and the cameras stopped rolling, there was only the silence, and in that silence one name kept rising to the surface like the moon drawn by the tide. Keanu. They hadn't worked together in years, hadn't even shared a screen since the days when their chemistry had audiences holding their breath. But the bond had remained, fragile yet indestructible, like a paper crane folded in the corner of a childhood memory box. They had each gone on to live full lives, different paths, different cities, different griefs. And yet there were those rare moments when fate seemed to tap gently on the shoulder, reminding you that some stories are not yet over. It was one such moment when the letter arrived handwritten, sealed in a deep blue envelope and slipped beneath her front door without fanfare. The handwriting was unmistakable. She hadn't seen it in years, but her heart recognized it before her eyes could confirm. "Sandra," it began, "I've been meaning to say something for a long time and I can't run from it anymore. Meet me at the top of the CN Tower in Toronto, this Sunday, noon. K." Sandra stared at the words for what felt like hours. Questions rushed in like a flood. Why now? What was he going to say? Why the CN Tower? But beneath the storm of curiosity was something deeper, a trembling flame of hope. She pressed the letter to her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered to herself, "Don't back out this time. Don't let fear steal this moment." That Sunday, the sky over Toronto was washed in pale sunlight, the kind that made every glass building shimmer and every street feel like a promise. The CN Tower stood tall, proud, and timeless, just like the memories Sandra carried in her heart. As the elevator ascended, a soft hum filled the air, but it could not quiet the storm building inside her. With each passing floor, she traveled not just upward but backward, to late-night shoots, quiet conversations on set, laughter shared over coffee, and the way Keanu would look at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. When the elevator doors opened, Sandra stepped into the observation deck with a quiet breath. The city stretched endlessly below, but she barely noticed it. Her eyes were locked on one thing, him. Keanu stood near the edge, his back to her, hands in his pockets, wearing a dark coat that swayed gently in the breeze from the vents. He turned slowly, as if he'd sensed her presence not by sound but by something deeper, something intuitive. Their eyes met. And in that moment, neither needed to speak. The years between them evaporated like morning mist. "You came," he said softly, his voice just above a whisper but loud enough to echo in her heart. "How could I not?" she replied, stepping closer. "I've been waiting." There was a long silence between them, not uncomfortable but sacred. Two souls recognizing each other in a world that often forgets what connection really means. "I've carried something for a long time, Sandra," Keanu began, his voice trembling slightly, as if the truth had become heavy with time. "And I think if I don't say it now, I never will." Sandra looked into his eyes, trying to read between the words, to understand what weight he bore. "I've told the world stories," he continued. "I've lived through pain, through loss, through silence, but the hardest story I never told was the one where I loved you and never had the courage to say it." The words didn't land like thunder. They arrived like soft rain on a dry field, slow, gentle healing. Sandra didn't speak. She just stared at him, eyes wide, heart pounding, mind reeling. Of all the things she imagined he might say, this was the one she had secretly hoped for but never dared believe. "I don't mean love like a crush or a passing feeling," he said, stepping closer now. "I mean the kind of love that anchors you, that changes your compass, that makes you rewrite what home means." Sandra swallowed hard. Her hands trembled, and for a moment she looked away, not because she didn't feel it too, but because the truth was so bright it almost hurt. "I loved you too," she whispered, tears threatening her eyes. "I still do, I always did." In that moment the city fell away. The height didn't matter, nor the years that had passed. All that existed was the truth, raw, untamed, and beautiful. Two hearts finally aligned, not in a rush of romance, but in a slow and sacred acknowledgement of what had always been. Keanu reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper, old and worn at the edges. He handed it to her. "I wrote this on the last day of filming Speed. I never gave it to you. Sandra unfolded the note carefully. Her hands covered her mouth as she read the words. If we're ever both free, meet me at the top of the CN Tower. I'll be waiting. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now. She laughed softly, heartbroken and healed all at once. You kept this all these years. Keanu nodded, his own eyes glassy. Because part of me always believed we'd find our way here. Maybe not when we were young, maybe not when we thought we were ready, but when we were brave enough. A long pause settled between them, thick with meaning, but then Sandra stepped forward and placed her hand in his. It wasn't a declaration, not a proposal, just a promise, that the truth they had long buried would never again be silenced. As they stood together, overlooking the city that bore witness to a secret finally set free, the wind whispered through the tower like a quiet applause. And somewhere far below, life moved on, unaware that two souls had just begun again. But this was only the beginning. The years they lost, the time they found. The air inside the cafe across from the CN Tower was rich with the aroma of roasted beans, cinnamon pastries, and something else, something unspoken yet deeply felt. Keanu and Sandra sat across from each other, no longer needing the grand view of the city to hold their attention. Instead, they were studying each other, catching up not just on years but on wounds. They had ordered 2 cups of black coffee, neither of which had been touched. There were more important things to sip, like the truth. For a long time, neither spoke. It wasn't awkward. It was reverent. They were sitting inside a moment that felt fragile, like a paper lantern drifting through time, threatening to vanish if disturbed too quickly. Keanu's hands were folded gently on the table, fingers interlaced with a patience that didn't demand answers but welcomed them. Sandra finally broke the silence with a breathy laugh, the kind that betrays both relief and disbelief. I can't believe we're here, she said. All these years, we let everything else get in the way, distance, work, life, our own fears. Keanu gave a soft smile, the kind that revealed no teeth but everything in his soul. Sometimes we need to walk through the forest alone before we recognize who is holding the map the entire time. Sandra's eyes filled again, but she blinked it back. She didn't want this moment to drown in tears. Do you remember the day we wrapped filming the lake house? She asked suddenly. He nodded, eyes warming with the memory. Yeah, you gave me that tiny glass bottle with a quote inside it. I kept it, you know. I hoped you would, she said, but I wasn't sure if you ever understood what it meant. He leaned forward slightly. I read it every year on my birthday. Time is the longest distance between 2 places. Tennessee Williams Wright. Sandra nodded slowly. I gave that to you because I already knew then. Knew what? He asked, though something in his voice already suggested he was bracing for a truth he long suspected. That I loved you, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her confession. But I also knew you weren't ready to carry that. Keanu didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't deny it. He only nodded slowly as if accepting both a gift and a wound in the same breath. I wasn't, he whispered. I had too many ghosts in the room with me, and I was terrified you'd see them and walk away. Sandra reached across the table, placing her hand on his. I would have stayed. Silence again, but this time it was like the silence of snowfall, heavy, soft, and somehow cleansing. Keanu finally broke it. Can I tell you what happened the day I wrote that note? He asked. The one I hid inside my coat pocket on the final day of Speed. She nodded, eyes locked on his. I watched you walk to your trailer after the last take, he said, eyes distant as if watching a film in his mind. Everyone was cheering, wrapping cables, laughing, but I couldn't move. You had this way of carrying yourself like joy and gravity lived in the same heartbeat. And I realized if I didn't say something right then, I might never get the chance again. But I froze, so I wrote it instead. I was 29 and still too broken to speak out loud what my heart already knew. Sandra swallowed the emotion rising in her throat. What would have happened if you had said it then? Keanu shrugged, but not with indifference, with humility. Maybe everything would have changed, or maybe we weren't meant to start then. Maybe we had to live the lives we lived to appreciate this one. Her hand was still on his, fingers now intertwined. Do you think it's too late? He looked at her, this time not with hesitation, but with clarity. No, I think the truth doesn't have an expiration date. It just waits for courage. And then for the first time in decades, they laughed freely together, not because something was funny, but because something was finally released. A tension, a question, a longing. They spent the next few hours walking through the heart of Toronto like tourists in their own lives. They visited bookstores, grabbed street food, and even took a ferry out to the islands. It wasn't a date. It wasn't nostalgia. It was reclamation of moments lost, of words unsaid, of possibilities once buried beneath the debris of busy lives. As the sun began to dip behind the skyline, painting the city in hues of amber and rose, Keanu paused near a railing overlooking the water. Sandra stood beside him, arms folded gently, hair caught in the breeze. "I've done a lot of interviews over the years," he said quietly. "People always ask me what love means or what I'm searching for. I usually give some abstract answer, peace, purpose, maybe someone to share silence with." "And what would you say now?" she asked. He turned to her, gaze steady. "That love is when you still think about someone's laugh 20 years later. That love is showing up not just once, but always. And that sometimes the best things take time because time is what teaches us how to treasure." Sandra didn't respond with words. She just leaned gently against his shoulder, allowing the moment to say what their lips hadn't yet found the strength to express. The city moved around them, indifferent, hurried, unaware, but here, between them, time stood still. That night, as they parted ways outside her hotel, Sandra turned to Keanu and said, "What now?" He smiled softly. "Now we don't run anymore." And with that, he leaned in and kissed her forehead, not with urgency, not with possession, but with reverence. It was the kiss of a man who had finally come home, and a woman who had waited with the patience of a heart that always knew. The elevator doors closed behind him as he left, but in her heart something had just opened. A door, a chapter, a second chance. And neither of them was willing to let it slip away again. The ghosts they never spoke about. In the days that followed their reunion at the CN Tower, both Sandra and Keanu found themselves walking through their lives as if some invisible weight had been lifted. Yet, at the same time, something deeper had taken root, not anxiety, not confusion, but a powerful stirring of memory. It was as if their souls, having finally reconnected, had begun to unbox the moments they had locked away in silence for years. And with that came a slow unraveling of emotion, of reflection, of everything they had buried behind polite smiles and professional distance. Keanu sat alone in his quiet Lowe's Angels home, lights dimmed low, a jazz record whispering from the corner, the same one they used to listen to during breaks on the set of the Lake House. He swirled a glass of red wine between his fingers but didn't drink it. His thoughts were full of Sandra, not just the woman she was now, but the girl she had been back then. He remembered the way she used to sit cross-legged in the makeup chair, telling stories that made everyone in the room laugh without trying too hard. He remembered how she had once stayed behind after everyone had gone, just to sit with him in silence after he received news about a friend's passing. She never asked questions. She just sat beside him, a quiet, immovable presence of empathy. He had loved her for that, not for her fame or her beauty or the way she lit up the screen, but for her stillness, her warmth, and the invisible strength that held up others even when no one saw it. Yet he had also feared her love, feared that if she ever truly saw the mess inside him, she would walk away. That had always been his story, hadn't it? People leaving. And so he had written his feelings down, folded them away, and let time devour the pages. But not this time. He picked up his phone and typed a message. "Let's not lose this again. Come back to Toronto. Let's spend a week just being us." Sandra read that message while standing at her kitchen counter in Austin, slicing lemons for her tea. She stared at the words for a full minute before replying. "I was hoping you'd ask." That was how it began, not a whirlwind romance, not a media frenzy, not a scripted reunion, but something quieter, deeper. A decision. Two people choosing to revisit the place where everything had shifted, not for nostalgia, but for understanding. The following week, they met again in Toronto, this time with no expectations and no cameras. Just two souls ready to ask the questions they had always been afraid to. They stayed in a modest penthouse overlooking the city with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony that breathed in the skyline. It wasn't luxury that mattered now, it was time. Real time. Time to talk. Time to heal. Time to remember. One evening, wrapped in blankets and watching the lights twinkle below, Sandra finally said it. "I didn't leave you, back then." Keanu turned his head, brows furrowing gently. "I never blamed you." "No," she said, "but I blamed myself." He waited. "I left acting for a while after that," she said quietly. "Not because I needed a break, but because I couldn't face the set without thinking of you. Every role I took felt hollow. Every scene without you beside me felt like I was faking it. So I ran. I told the press it was for family, told myself it was for rest, but it was because loving you in silence was becoming too painful. Keanu's chest rose and fell with a weight he hadn't felt in years. I would have gone with you, he said, voice low. She smiled faintly. I know, that's why I didn't ask. They fell into silence again, watching the clouds drift between buildings like passing memories. Then Keanu spoke. My sister died the same year we wrapped the lake house, he said. I didn't tell anyone. Sandra blinked, turning to him fully. Oh, Keanu. I didn't want anyone's pity, he continued. But more than that, I didn't want to invite anyone into that kind of grief. I thought I could protect people by keeping them out, including you. She didn't say anything. She just reached for his hand. I thought love meant shielding the people you care about from your darkness, he said. But it turns out love is letting them in anyway. Sandra nodded slowly. You weren't the only one with ghosts, you know. I had my own. They spent hours that night peeling back the layers, talking about fame and loneliness, about the choices they made, the things they regretted, the paths they didn't take. They didn't cry loudly. They didn't yell. There was no dramatic collapse, just two people unfolding honestly, gently, bravely. And as the dawn approached and the first rays of morning crept through the window, something sacred happened. They smiled. Not a forced smile for the camera, not a public smile for fans, a real one, the kind that rises from a place where pain has finally been met with truth. I used to imagine what it would be like if we ever had this moment, Sandra said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I used to write fake letters in my journal to you, as if one day you'd read them. Do you still have them? He asked. I do. I'd like to read them someday. You will. And with that they fell asleep, not in each other's arms, but side by side, the way trust begins. The city continued below, unaware of the two souls quietly rewriting their story. But something was beginning to shift, something neither of them expected. The world was watching. Somehow, without meaning to, without even speaking publicly, their presence in Toronto had sparked something on social media. Photos were surfacing. People whispering about the two icons seen strolling the streets, laughing near a flower market, buying books at a used bookstore. And now the pressure was returning. The media wanted answers. Rumors were swirling. Headlines were being written. And the quiet sanctuary they had found was now beginning to fracture under the weight of outside eyes. The question was no longer whether they loved each other. The question now was, could love survive the world watching? The noise outside the silence. The morning after their conversation about ghosts and regrets, Sandra awoke before sunrise. The sky was still bruised with the final shades of night, but the world outside was already beginning to stir. She stood on the balcony wrapped in one of the hotel's oversized robes, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Below her, Toronto yawned awake, streetlights blinking off, taxis weaving through the early fog, lives beginning without knowing that just 30 floors above, history was quietly rewriting itself. Her mind was racing, not with fear, but with a strange sense of exposure, like the warmth she had discovered with Keanu was now visible, vulnerable, no longer protected by the veil of anonymity. Inside the suite, Keanu was still asleep, his breath steady, arms tucked beneath the pillow, expression serene in a way only someone who had battled storms could wear. Sandra watched him through the glass, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. She loved this version of him, the one unguarded by cameras, untouched by roles or reputation. And yet even now her heart pulsed with a cautious ache. They had found something rare, something pure, but how long could it survive once the world began to claw at it? By noon, that question became more than philosophical. The first headlines had already surfaced. Keanu and Sandra back together. Romance rekindled at CN Tower, spotted again. Fans catch Keanu and Sandra holding hands in Toronto. The photos weren't intrusive, not yet. Just distant, blurry shots of them walking together near Queen Street, talking outside a used bookstore, sipping coffee at a patio table. But it was enough. Enough to awaken the press. Enough to feed the algorithms. Enough to break the spell of their sacred bubble. Sandra saw it first on her phone, then on her assistant's texts, then in the dozens of missed calls from publicists and old colleagues. She didn't panic, not outwardly. She simply sat down at the kitchen counter of their suite, exhaled slowly, and waited for Keanu to wake up. When he emerged minutes later, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, she handed him her phone. He studied the screen in silence. Then softly, so it begins. She nodded, are we ready for this? Keanu set the phone down, ran a hand through his hair, and gave her a look that carried equal parts weariness and conviction. "We were never meant to be anyone's spectacle," he said. "But if we back away now, we hand this over to them, and I've spent too many years staying quiet." Sandra swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "I don't care what the headlines say," she whispered, "but I don't want to lose us again." Keanu moved to her, taking her face gently in his hands. "Then we don't," he said. "No hiding, no denying, just honesty." That was the moment she knew they were crossing a line, not into scandal, not into publicity, but into vulnerability that couldn't be undone. There was something radical about telling the truth when the world preferred mystery. And so they decided to do it their way, not with a press statement or a red carpet appearance, but with life, with presence. They stayed in Toronto, continued their quiet walks, continued their dinners in tucked-away places and museum visits and moments of laughter so deep it brought tears. And slowly, something strange began to happen. The public began to soften. The press, expecting a scandal or a performance, found nothing but simplicity. Two people rediscovering each other in a city that didn't try to steal their light. Fans posted pictures respectfully. "We saw them," one viral post read, "and they looked like two people who waited decades to finally be able to laugh freely." But not everyone was so gracious. Sandra's team began pushing back. "You've got 2 offers on the table for major projects," her agent warned, "and you're jeopardizing both. Studios don't want the distraction." Keanu's representatives echoed similar concerns. "You're trending again, that's good. But if it turns into a tabloid circus, it'll tarnish your legacy." They sat together in their suite, listening to those voices play out in voicemails and forwarded emails. The pressure was palpable, but so was the clarity. "This industry never understood us," Sandra said. "They liked the idea of us, but not the reality." "They wanted chemistry," Keanu added, "but not connection." And then came the invitation. A major studio wanted them to reunite on screen. A romantic drama, perfectly timed to capitalize on the resurgence of public interest. A project that promised everything: prestige, exposure, critical acclaim. But as Keanu held the script in his hands and Sandra read the first few pages, a strange silence fell over the room. "It's beautiful," she admitted, "but it feels staged." "It's not our story," Keanu said. "No," she replied. "Ours is quieter, less polished, messy, real." That night they turned it down. And that decision changed everything. Suddenly the narrative shifted. Keanu and Sandra reject big studio offer. Why? The media began to speculate. Rumors swirled again. Were they hiding something? Were they fighting back against Hollywood? Was this a quiet protest or a private breakdown? They refused to comment. Instead, they turned inward. They took a train to a small village outside Ontario, a place where no one recognized them. They rented a cabin by a lake, far from the internet, far from expectation. And for 3 days they lived like ordinary people, cooked meals together, read books aloud, took naps in hammocks, watched the stars without cameras flashing. They didn't speak of the world waiting outside. Until one night, beneath a sky awash with constellations, Keanu said, "I used to think love was a thing you found and held. Now I know it's something you build every day or it disappears." Sandra turned to him, tears gently tracing her cheeks. "Then let's keep building, even when it's hard, even when the world doesn't understand." He nodded, especially then. And with that, they made a promise, not to the world, not to the industry, not to fans or followers or agents, but to each other, that no matter how loud the outside became, they would protect the quiet between them. They would not let headlines write their story. They would not allow legacy to become a prison. Because finally, after years of silence, they had found something louder than fame. They had found truth. And that was only the beginning. When silence became the loudest answer, the small lakeside cabin had become more than a retreat. It had become a sanctuary. In a world that often confused love with spectacle, here was a quiet reminder that not all intimacy had to be declared from rooftops. Sandra and Keanu woke each morning with the sound of birdsong rather than phone alarms, their days filled with walks along muddy trails, simple meals cooked over crackling stoves, and long hours spent not in talking, but in being. There was a certain peace to this rhythm, the kind that only arrives when two people are no longer trying to impress each other, but instead simply exist beside one another, raw and whole. But peace has a strange fragility, especially when it exists in contrast to the world's noise. Their agents had stopped calling not out of respect, but because they were beginning to give up. Projects were being recast. Interviews were being redirected. The industry's silence, once feared, now arrived like a warning, be forgotten or return on its terms. Yet neither Sandra nor Keanu seemed ready to cave. They had spent decades living inside the machinery of fame. Now, for the first time, they were tasting life without its interference, and it was addictive. Still, the silence began to shift. It happened one afternoon while Sandra was tending to a small herb garden outside the cabin. A distant car engine groaned against the gravel road, followed by the crunch of tires. Keanu stepped outside, his body tensing instinctively. A single car, unmarked, windows darkened. It parked 50 feet away, and out stepped a woman in black jeans, blazer, and tinted glasses, a journalist. Keanu's fists tightened slightly, not from anger, but from instinct. Sandra rose to her feet, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I'm not here to chase you," the journalist said calmly, hands raised in apology. "I'm here to ask one question off the record." Keanu and Sandra exchanged a glance. He nodded. "Why now?" the woman asked softly. "Why did you finally come back to each other after all this time?" Sandra studied her for a moment, then replied, "Because grief ends, but love doesn't." The journalist blinked. Keanu stepped forward. "We were afraid of the wrong things for too long, afraid of timing, of loss, of the opinions of people we'd never even meet. But the truth, the only thing worth being afraid of is silence between two people who should have always spoken." The woman didn't take notes. She didn't record. She just nodded once, then quietly left. That night, without consent, without names, a single quote appeared on an independent blog. "Grief ends, but love doesn't. They taught me that without saying who they were." And somehow that was enough to light a spark again. Not the firestorm of paparazzi, but something gentler, an awakening. Comment sections began to shift. Instead of invasiveness, there was reverence. Instead of gossip, gratitude. Fans across the world began sharing stories of their own missed chances, their own long-lost loves. "Keanu and Sandra," one post read, "are proof that sometimes love waits, and sometimes it returns." But the peace wouldn't last. 3 days later, Sandra received a call. Her father, who had been quietly battling illness, had taken a turn. She needed to leave. Immediately. The warmth of the cabin, the quiet lake, the slow-burning magic, all of it froze in an instant. There was no time for goodbye, no drawn-out farewell, just a packed bag, a tearful hug, and the whisper of a promise. "I'll come back to you." Keanu stood on the porch, watching her car disappear into the horizon, the cold air biting into his skin. For the first time in weeks, he felt the chill of loneliness return. But he didn't follow. He didn't chase. He knew some journeys had to be made alone. Back in Los Angeles, Sandra stepped into a storm. Her father was weaker than she expected. Her family needed her. The media had resurfaced. Interviews, appearances, questions, all waiting to be answered. And suddenly she felt like she was slipping again, slipping into that old life, the one where she made decisions for everyone but herself. Days turned into weeks. She didn't return his calls right away, not because she didn't want to, but because she was afraid of what she might say. What if she lost her father? What if grief made her retreat again? What if, in trying to hold on to Keanu, she let herself drown? Keanu, too, remained still. He sent messages, checked in, but never pushed. He had learned the hard way that love was not about possession. It was about presence, even in absence. And then, one evening, just as winter began to whisper through Toronto again, Sandra called. "I'm scared," she said. "He's not going to make it." Keanu's voice on the other end was steady, like the wind over still water. "Then let me carry you through it." She wept, not because she was weak, but because someone had finally said the one thing no one else had, that she didn't have to be strong alone. For the first time in her life, she allowed someone in during her breaking. And Keanu did exactly what he promised. He flew to her, quietly. No cameras, no announcement. He sat in the hospital room with her, held her hand while her father slipped away, stood behind her at the funeral, whispered strength into her when she had none left. Love had returned, not in grand gestures, not in epic declarations, but in presence. In silence, in shared grief, in unspoken vows. Weeks later, back in Los Angeles, Sandra stood at the edge of her garden, sunlight kissing her face, and said aloud, "I want to go back." Keanu beside her asked, "To Toronto?" She nodded, "No, to us." He smiled, and in that moment, everything was clear. Love had never been about a tower or a city or a perfect time. Love was about showing up, when it mattered, when it hurt, when it healed. And now it was finally time. Time to return. Time to begin again. The promise they finally kept. The snow in Toronto fell softly that winter morning, cloaking the city in silence, as if the streets and skyscrapers themselves were holding their breath. The CN Tower, timeless and proud, rose above the blanket of white like a monument to the choices that brought them here. Keanu stood at the base, coat buttoned against the wind, gloves clenched in his pockets. There was no press this time, no crowds, no whispers on social media, just the sky above and the truth inside. He glanced at his watch, then at the sky, then back at the path behind him. She wasn't late, but his heart was already racing. It had been 4 months since Sandra's father passed. 4 months of quiet healing. 4 months where grief and gratitude lived side by side. In that time, they hadn't made any grand proclamations. They hadn't given the world the reunion it craved. They had simply lived in shared mornings, in held hands, in whispered affirmations that the past no longer held power over them. But today was different. Today was a decision. He had asked her not as an actor, not as a symbol of what they once were, but as a man finally unafraid to want. "Come back with me," he had said, "to the place it started, this time not as two people searching for timing, but as two people choosing each other." The elevator ride to the top was quiet. As it rose, Keanu remembered everything, their first walk down that hallway, the way her voice cracked when she told him she had loved him for years, the note he had carried like a secret prayer for 2 decades. He remembered the way her fingers had wrapped around his in the cafe, how her tears had fallen without shame, how he had finally said the words that had waited a lifetime to be spoken. And as the doors opened again, he stepped out into the glass ring of the observation deck, the city sprawling beneath him like 1,000 unopened letters. Then he heard her footsteps. He turned, and there she was. Sandra stepped out of the elevator wearing a long beige coat, her hair loose, face untouched by makeup, more radiant than he had ever remembered. She walked slowly, as if letting every step be its own vow, and when she reached him, neither spoke for a long time. There was nothing more to explain. Every silence between them had already spoken volumes. What remained now was not confession, but commitment. "I told myself I wouldn't cry," she said, laughing through her breath. "It's okay if you do," he replied. "Just don't run this time." "I'm not running," she whispered. "Not anymore." They stood at the edge, palms pressed against the glass, the city below unaware of the miracle unfolding above. Keanu reached into his coat pocket, not for a ring, not for anything dramatic, but for a folded piece of paper. A new one. Sandra looked down at it, eyes narrowing gently. "Another letter." He nodded. "I wrote it last week, after we said we'd come here." She unfolded it, hands trembling slightly. "This is not a love story. This is a remembering of who we were before fear rewrote our paths, of who we are now, not because we found each other again, but because we finally stopped hiding. I don't need a stage. I don't need applause. I just need this, you, me, now, and whatever life waits below this tower." When she looked up, her eyes were full but steady. "You know what I realized?" "What?" "That the tower wasn't a symbol of the truth you were hiding. It was a lighthouse. You weren't afraid to speak. You were just waiting for me to come close enough to hear." Keanu stepped forward and kissed her, soft, slow, reverent. The kiss wasn't the climax. It wasn't the fairytale ending. It was the beginning, a sealing of everything they had fought for: time, truth, tenderness. They spent the rest of that day walking through the city hand in hand. No disguises, no scripts, just two people who had finally found the courage to live out loud. People recognized them, of course, how could they not? But no one interrupted, no one invaded, because the energy around them was different now, sacred, and people could feel it. Later that evening, sitting at a small dinner table in a quiet, candlelit restaurant, Sandra turned to him and asked, "So what now?" Keanu sipped his wine, eyes warm. "We do what we never allowed ourselves to do before." "Which is?" "Live together, no clock, no distance, no silence." And she smiled. "I'd like that." He reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. "Then let's promise each other this: from now on we speak, even when it's messy, even when it's hard." "Especially then," she replied, echoing the vow they had made once before. That night there were no grand announcements, no photos posted, no press releases sent out. But word still spread, slowly, quietly, like poetry passed between friends. And people began saying things like, they didn't just fall in love, they grew into it, they bled into it, and then they chose it again. Weeks later, Sandra released a small essay online. A personal one, not for press, not for promotion. It read, "Some stories aren't meant to explode, they're meant to burn slowly until they become truth. I found mine again at the top of a tower in Toronto, and this time I'm not letting go." The world didn't need more proof. They had already seen it. In the quiet, in the stillness, in the way love, when held with both hands, becomes unbreakable, even after decades apart. And so, as the snow melted and spring returned to the streets of Toronto, so too did a love long buried beneath time. Reborn, not because it had waited, but because they had grown strong enough to meet it again. And this time, they stayed. The end.